and welcome to Searching Further. This time we're joined by Claudia Antolini, who has a PhD in astrophysics, but is now a science communicator and an activist for diversity in STEM. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and a bit more about your background.
Hi, Chris. First of all, thank you for having me because it is a really nice interview series and I'm honored and thrilled to be a part of it. So as you mentioned, I have a PhD in astrophysics. Before that, I also got a bachelor's in physics and a master's degree in astrophysics. So I did the full ride, let's say. And I did all of my studies in Italy. And then during my PhD, I started going around the world. Actually, the first country I ever lived in was the United Kingdom. So now I am back.
You can stay away.
No, I definitely couldn't. What can I say? You know, I just didn't fancy the sunshine and the great food.
Hey.
No, I do love the UK, and it was sort of a dream of mine to come and live here longer term. So I've come full circle in a sense. So after my first experience abroad in the United Kingdom, I then went to China for my first postdoc. Then I had a time during that postdoc in Germany. Then I went back to Italy. Then I decided I was going to steer my career in a different direction. And that's when I moved to Vienna. And then I got my first job in the United Kingdom as a science communicator. So then in 2017, I moved back to the UK more permanently because it's been almost 5 years and I'm still here going strong. So this is a bit my story in a linear way, very straightforward way. A couple other things about me, beyond the fact that clearly I've traveled a lot and I've done a fair few things around science and physics and astronomy and science communication. I have a huge passion for acting and singing. Sometimes I make videos where I sing and I change the lyrics to sing about science, or I just sing songs that I personally like because I like them. And clearly COVID hasn't been helpful for this, let's put it mildly, but I am a very keen amateur actress. And when I can, you work allowing and rest of my personal life allowing, I do like to be on a stage, and I like acting and figuring out different characters. I like trying to do comedy. And people enjoy it. Let's say I never heard complaints. So I have my scientific side, but I also have a more creative and performance-oriented side of myself.
I suppose that kind of feeds quite a lot into your science communication, I suppose, being kind of like multifaceted and just sort of like being able to take a concept and then recontextualize it and share it with other people. And just, I suppose, having kind of like that acting inside of you. I don't know, does that give you a little bit more self-confidence just to kind of be out in front of people and to talk about what you love?
Yes, I feel like this performance side of me, being acting or singing, first of all, gives you a lot more sensitivity to gauge how the audience is reacting to you, which is incredibly important when you're doing science communication. And it gives you the ability to put yourself with someone else's shoes, which is also something else which is incredibly important, because when I'm talking about something which is quite abstract, maybe quite far away from the everyday experience, I have to understand what is that person's motivation to listen to me. In the same way that when I'm studying a character, I have to understand what is their motivation rather than mine to act in a certain way, to say a certain thing. So these are a couple of ways in which me being on a stage informs the way I do my job, because when you're choosing your words, you have to be so careful, because that's your chance that you have to come through to someone else, and you have to give the right impression, you have to do it right. And being careful about what I'm saying and the way I move and the way I use my voice, all of these are things that my acting background, my singing background contribute to. Not just in a sense of, yeah, I'm very extroverted, I'm very much of a people's person. Sure, that can help, but it's not the end of it. It's rather, how do I analyze what I do, and how do I analyze how people react to what I do?
I suppose it adds a little bit of extra sort of layer of empathy and kind of like just sort of understanding where being in someone else's shoes, as you say, and just sort of like trying to recontextualize how you're being presented to these other people and how they are taking your message.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also about being able not to take yourself too seriously, which is really, really important, because we grow up with this sort of stereotypical image of scientists as someone that always knows what to say, always knows what to do, and is very self-assured, and almost to the point that it becomes boring. You know, it's a very two-dimensional portrait. But people relate to you when you're genuine. People relate to you when you can play with who you are, and can relate to them at many different levels. And I think that that is so important, not just to do good science communication, but also to let people know that to be a scientist, you can be in a lot of different ways. You don't have to be you don't have to fit a certain mold. You don't have to fit in that specific box, and that is the only specific way that you can be a scientist. So that's something quite important to me.
I suppose it kind of demonstrates that scientists are real people too, that they have other interests and they have different faculties, and I don't know, also adopting kind of like other ways of looking at the world, because obviously science is one lens of looking at it, but arts is another, and they can inform each other, but they can also, I don't know, conflict at times, but just sort of like having sort of, I don't know, a greater way of understanding kind of like what you're seeing and what you're experiencing in the world, just sort of like, yeah, just adds an extra layer to your understanding, I suppose.
Yeah, in a sense that is true, but also, why should me being a scientist mean that I have to give up on everything else that I am?
Of course, yeah.
I wouldn't want to do that. I don't think no one should.
No, of course, yeah. You said before that you took a very kind of standard physics pathway through doing your undergraduate and your master's, and then your PhD, obviously in astrophysics. Was science always something you were interested in, or were, like, you talk about your acting before, like I don't know, like what were you able at school to kind of explore all these areas as you would like to your fullest, do you think?
So in order to answer this question, I have to give a short explanation that I didn't study in the British educational system. The Italian system is a bit different.
Okay.
So in that way, I think I was actually able to explore different sides and different things more than if I had been a kid growing up here, in a sense. Not because one system is better than the other, necessarily, but just because I had the chance to explore more things in a way that maybe, you know, if I had to choose when I was 13 or 14, start picking my GCSE subjects and my A-level subjects in a similar way as to what is done here, maybe my life would have been very, very different, because when I was 13, 14, I didn't know that I wanted to be a scientist yet. Mm-hmm. It's something that I matured more when I was around 17, 18, which is still fairly early for someone to definitely feel like, yes, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. So I was very lucky that I had that time to explore different things. So what I did actually for my secondary school studies, I did, my curriculum was centered on classical studies. So I did 5 years of Greek and Latin, because clearly Italian culture is very still embedded and has a very strong mark from Latin as a language and from Greek culture as well, because that's pretty much our historical heritage. And then during those 5 years of quite intensive studies in something that apparently has very little to do with physics, I discovered that actually maybe that's what I wanted to do. And then I went forward and did it, but I have a very different start as opposed to what people might generally expect of me. I did enjoy science for sure, but I didn't know it's definitely what I wanted. I didn't know just yet. There were a lot of different things that I liked, and there were a lot of different things that I didn't particularly like, but my heart wasn't set on physics when I was, say, 13. I wouldn't have thought I was going to be a physicist when I was that age. And that's fine. I think it's important to allow yourself to explore different things that you might like and you might not like, to expose yourself. Knowing that you don't like something is actually great because it allows you to cross something off. But unless you try it, you're never going to know.
Can you remember that little turning point when you thought, actually, yeah, I do want to start my life of my new life of learning about physics for the next 7, 8 years, however long you were in university for?
More than that. Actually, I do. And it's a quite sort of emotional story because I had this really light bulb moment. It was actually after my first job. So my first job was at the summer camp with younger people. I was 18. So I was young in a sense, but also I was relatively old. Like, by the time, had I been in the UK, by that time I was already supposed to have enrolled in my A levels. And actually that job didn't end up that well because some of the kids left the camp after a week. And so they didn't need as many facilitators. So they told me, we don't really need you anymore for all the hours that we initially hired you for. And that was tough. It was bad. I felt horrible. It was the first time I had something closer to a proper job. And it felt awful. I was very, very disheartened. And the family friend that was there, for whichever reason, I'm never going to know, gave me a newspaper article about the Cassini mission. So for context, this was 2004. And I remember I was reading this thing and I just didn't care anymore. Like, I went from being just absolutely sad and feeling terrible about myself, feeling like this is about me and I made a mistake and I'm good for nothing, to, whoa, Saturn is cool. So I realized that this was happening inside my head, and I realized this is what I have to do in my life. Because if it was able to turn my world around from being completely hopeless to just captivating me and just making me feel like I really want to know more about this, then maybe this is what life is supposed to be about. Do something that you truly love, and something that just changes things for you, and makes you feel better. And it's such a weird story, because again, scientists are supposed to be super rational people, and this is not a super rational story. This is a story of a young woman reading a tiny piece of paper in a little hotel room at a summer camp and figuring out her calling. Is that how science works? I'm not sure, but this is how it worked for me.
I suppose talking to a lot of scientists, especially science communicators, no one has a standard story, it seems. Everyone sort of, I don't know, finds that flame in a different way. And I don't know, especially it seems with science communicators, they want to try and share that kind of epiphany moment with others, it seems.
I mean, I think the bottom line is there is no such thing as a standard story. All the people I spoke to that ended up pursuing science, or any other field for that matters, it's never stereotypical. It's never how you think it is. It's almost never, sometimes it is, but it's very rarely the standard story of, oh yes, I had a telescope and I was stargazing every night as a kid. For some people it is, but for plenty of other people it's not. And that's great. That's fantastic. It's about learning to listen to yourself and seeing what fires you, and feeling what is it that really makes you fly, and you see how to structure your life in a way that works well with that. And this can be about your career, this can be about your community, it can be about your family, it can be about anything. It's about find what is the purpose that drives you, what is that something that makes you feel like, yes, this is the really thing, this is really the thing that moves me. And then you go with it as much as possible. And by following your purpose, you are truly being yourself, you're being authentic to yourself, and that's how you can bring value to the world around you.
No, that's I think that's a great story and a great sentiment as well. As well as your science communication work, you do quite a lot of activism for diversity in STEM, and you work for an organization called Tiger in STEM, double M, so science, technology, engineering, maths, and medicine. Is that correct? Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about the work that Tiger in STEM does, please?
So I don't work for Tigers in STEM, as in Tigers in STEM is not an organization that hires. We are all volunteers, which is great, and we love it that way. I work with Tiger in STEM. I would rather say than work for them, because it's a very wide group. It brings together people from lots of different subject areas, from lots of different walks of life, from different careers, from different backgrounds, which is the strength of this kind of group, because everyone has a voice and everyone's experience is valued, and we all have this perspective that we want to improve the state of things in academia when it comes to the STEM fields. So that's how I would describe it. It's an advocacy group that focuses on addressing equality, diversity, and inclusion topics in and around academia. But because right now, for example, my job is not strictly an academic job in the traditional sense of the word, because I don't do scientific research, but I still work alongside academics. I still work in the framework of academia. So it's about what can my perspective bring, or how can I listen to other people that have a different background than mine, and what can I learn from them, and how can I make space for people who are not like me? How can I make space, especially for people who might have faced more barriers than me? And instead of accidentally closing doors without maybe even realizing that I'm doing it, how do I encourage but also support people that maybe wouldn't normally have a chance to approach these things and to dedicate their life to doing research? How do I make that possible for more people?
No, so that's really interesting. So how has the, I don't know, over like the past like 5 years, how has the, I don't know, the climate about diversity and inclusion changed, do you believe, in STEM in general or in the space sector, do you think? And do you think what more could be done? I know it's a big question. I know I kind of...
It's a big question. I think in the last, I mean, it's hard to answer with a time scale because these are at the same time, it feels like it's a long time, but it's also not a long time, if that makes sense. I think in the last decade or so, there has been change. I feel like with respect to my personal experience during my PhD, which was also done in a different country, there's a different level of awareness, which definitely doesn't mean we are at the end of the journey. The thing that more and more people are starting to realize, and it was time, is that diversity doesn't mean inclusion. Inclusion doesn't mean equity. My personal catchphrase, in a sense, is if you don't practice inclusion, you don't deserve diversity. So just for the people that may not know what these terms mean, equality means that everyone can achieve the same, regardless of their background. Inclusion means everyone feels valued and respected, and also because they might have a different life experience, and that is fully taken into consideration. Diversity is that your organization has a range of different backgrounds, a range of different experiences that are represented. But if you did diversity work at a very basic level, you might still attract people that look different from each other or sound different from each other, but it's more of a facade rather than a truly revolutionary thing that you've done there. So that's why, for me, you know, people refer to my advocacy as advocacy for diversity in STEM, which is okay, but I consider myself more of an inclusion advocate, if that makes sense, because I believe that unless we make STEM, the space sector, truly inclusive, not only we might not necessarily achieve diversity, but the diversity that we achieve is not much more than a photo op. Is that we have people that are there, but then if people from backgrounds that are not the typical picture of what a scientist is supposed to be and look like, they will leave because maybe they are experiencing harassment in the workplace, and maybe someone else will join from that non-traditional background, but that doesn't mean they're being supported. It just means they are there in that moment, and I want to go beyond that. And what is there to be done? I mean, we only have an hour, so I don't know if I can really say all the things I think we should do. And for that matters, there's lots of people that might give you a lot of other ideas. A lot of them will be more qualified and smarter than me. So it's always about understanding what it is that you want to achieve. What does inclusion mean to your organization? Who are you focusing on? Why are you focusing on that particular thing? And how can you look at your structure to make sure it is truly inclusive? Because we talk about inclusive language quite a lot, which is important. Okay, it's really good. But if I have the most perfectly inclusive language and then I still can't access parental leave, that's not going to help me a whole lot, is it?
No, it's
I don't have that.
It's putting a fresh coat of paint on something and just saying, well, we're now using inclusive language, but we don't have the scaffolding behind the building to really support these people's additional needs or their requirements from coming from a different background or whatever. I know the disadvantages they might have experienced kind of trying to enter these fields that are primarily kind of white, middle-class, male, cis environments.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about if you don't accept that you have to look at your structure and really reflect on that and really dare to change something that has always been that way, and it's going to be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Real change is very hard to come by. So there has certainly been more awareness, and a sad part of it are all the cases of harassment that are now coming to surface, and the fact that we know about these things now when we wouldn't have 15 years ago, 10 years ago, a lot less. It's a bad thing in the sense that it shouldn't happen. Mm-hmm. It's a bad thing in the sense that now more people feel empowered to talk about it. And hopefully it pushes more and more people in power to reflect on what has to change. And it gives us the power of keeping people accountable. Because if I keep seeing my institution, having a bad reputation for harassment, I'm going to go to my institution and say, hey, this isn't that happened. Not only how did you address that, but how are we going to build a culture where harassment doesn't happen? Not just necessarily when harassment is punished, but where it doesn't happen, where it's not this kind of aggressive behavior that gets rewarded, where we move away from a culture of excellence that means you have to work 15 hours a day and publish 20 papers a year, otherwise you're useless. Because unless we see that culture for what it is, a product of a system, we're never going to dismantle it. One of the things that really pushes my button is when someone tells me, oh, but we've always done it that way. And I'm like, okay, so we're not going to do it that way then, because if we've always done it this way and we see this result, then maybe I don't want to do it the way it's always been done.
And yeah, especially when, I don't know, organizations put these like women in STEM events on or similar kind of flavors of, and they think that, oh, we've done this now, we've raised awareness, job done sort of thing, where it's just sort of like patting each other on the back and a little bit navel gazing, just like, no, like knowing is half the battle, but it's not really. It's actually just the start, and some fundamental changes need to be made.
Well, there are a lot of different initiatives going on, some of which are more effective than others. I think that reflection is incredibly important, but if you're not willing, as I was mentioning earlier, to take this further step and actually daring to be disruptive and daring to accept that there is a problem with your institution, and that you have to solve it, because it's your duty to solve it. It's your duty to solve it from the perspective of gender. It's your duty to solve it from the perspective of sexual orientation and gender identity. It's your duty to solve it from the perspective of ethnicity and religion. It's your duty to resolve it for disability and for so many other aspects of our identity that are just swept under the carpet. We can never really change if we don't accept that we're going to be uncomfortable, that we're going to face issues, like real issues that people will push back for wanting to change, because change is change is hard. Change is hard work. You have to convince tons of people to actually do it. And then you have to keep going at this. It's not going to happen overnight. So sure, let's do a celebration for LGBT plus women and people in STEM. Sorry, I said women, I meant people. I had a slip of the tongue. But sure, let's do it. What is the organization also actually doing to make sure that LGBT plus people are included at every stage of the life of that community? Do you have a code of conduct that gives guidance on how to behave if there's an incident? Do you provide education to your staff around how to support a person that is transitioning? Do you do that? You know, this and a million other things that I could say. Because if you're not doing that and you're just having the event, it's a start. But after a while, it becomes sugarcoating. It's not actual change. It's something that in jargon of equality, diversity, and inclusion is called performative. You're showing that you're super cool and you really care about these things, but actually you're not really accepting that to be uncomfortable with your feelings. You're not really accepting that your institution needs to change. You're not really daring to be disruptive and doing the hard work. You're not really doing these things.
No, and it's I don't know, as you say, we've made some positive steps, but there's still a long way to go, it seems. But yeah, I think it's just going to be paved in, hard work and, I don't know, feeling uncomfortable, I suppose, with knowing your own shortcomings and being willing to kind of put your neck on the line to make some institutional changes, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I also want to say a word of encouragement, because when I say, oh, you know, there's still a work to be done and lots of institutions, you know, stop at a very superficial level. Yes, it's true. It's a lot. There's a lot to do. It's not going to be done overnight, but there's still a lot that we can do. There is still a lot that we individually can contribute to this. And there's a lot that allies can do, because it could be fairly easy to think, oh, you know, but I belong to this demographics that is always represented. So what do I do? Maybe there's nothing for me to do, because I should just listen to what people with different experiences have to say. Yes, do that. That's good. That's important to do. But also you can do other things. You can support this change. You can be a part of this change. You can, not only you can, it's needed. We need more allies.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. And yeah, it's a fantastic, well, it's more than a sentiment, it's a bit of a call to action, I suppose. Just like, is there any, I don't know, what sort of advice would you give to anyone who is hoping to, I don't know, improve themselves and just sort of like help be a better ally, I suppose?
That's a great one, isn't it? Because now I have this platform to go and speak to potential allies and tell them what is the one thing I want them to do. So I have to answer very carefully. Read a lot of stuff. That's always a good one. But also observe yourself and what you do and how you might unintentionally, okay, propagate either a stereotype about yourself, or either you might be propagating or acting according to a stereotype about someone else. And it's not that you're necessarily doing it on purpose, okay, but it could be something that you're accidentally doing because you're embedded in this way of thinking, in this upbringing that we all have. But because as an ally, you recognize that you belong to a more privileged group, you don't experience it on your own skin. You don't get the bad end out of it. So start to acknowledge when it is that you're getting the good stuff out of it. Maybe, let's have a classic example. Happens to me, still happens to me sometimes. I go to a meeting. There's not lots of other women in the meeting. I say something, another woman said something. Not much happens. 5 minutes later, a man says the same thing. And people say, oh yeah, that's a great point. Recognize when that happens to you. Recognize when you accidentally say something and you realize, oh, actually, this person has said it before. And now I might get credit for it and say, no, actually, that was the other person saying that. That these are very small things, but they are incredibly important. I made an example about gender here, but this can extend to cover a lot of different things.
Sure, yeah. Just, I don't know, in my general experience, just sort of like, just accepting that sometimes you're going to make mistakes, but be willing to face up to those mistakes and just try and do better next time, I suppose.
Yes, as far as you do show that, you are learning and you're on that path, you're not going to become unwelcome suddenly because you made one mistake. Of course, it's going to be up to you to improve. It's going to be up to you to show that you're learning. And maybe that means for some time, you can take a break and do some more reflection rather than practical actions. And that's okay. As far as you do make a journey of learning and you see the harm that could be absolutely unintentional, but you see the harm in what you've done, you understand how some people have been hurt by your actions, and you stop apologizing if someone was offended, and you start understanding that your actions caused hurt, because impact is more important than intention. That's a really, really important thing to understand for an ally. And this is a really important thing for me to remind myself of every single day, that I get it wrong, because I am really, really far from being perfect. I'm really, really far from knowing everything that there is to know about everything I would like to know. I don't. And sometimes I am silly and I make mistakes and I fall prey to this toxic upbringing, and I fall prey to my own internal biases, as we all do. But I try to do better. I try to learn. And if someone decides that they would rather not interact with you, you accept it. And you say, okay, that hurts, but it's their choice, because I take responsibility for my actions.
No, I feel, yeah, that's such an important point, and just thank you for sharing that with us. My last question really is, what advice would you give to, well, either your younger self or any young people who are thinking of entering, we say space science, but just the space sector really, if they're interested in some area of space related or STEM career pathways, what advice would you give to them, do you think?
If I think of myself, like when I was 14, 15, you are better than you think you are. You're asking yourself this question, it means it is something that you want. So don't give up until you gave it your all. because it means this is something that is firing you. If this is something that is creating that passion within you, you have to see where it goes. You have to follow it and get a flavor of where it could lead you, and see whether that's still what you want or not. And you might encounter issues, you might encounter obstacles. We know that the space sector is far from being a perfect place for everyone. But it doesn't mean that there's not people that have your back. I have your back. Other good people are there that have your back and that will be there and root for you and support you and listen to you and see what we can do to change things to make them better. So get to the point that it's your choice, that you want to go for this or not.
No, I think that's so important. And I think it really it also kind of links back to what you say about even just follow something through. And if you decide then you don't like it, then it's not a failure. It's a different pathway. It's a branch, I suppose, from what you were doing, and you get to just sort of redefine what you want to do with yourself.
It's all, I mean, trying something and then seeing it's not right for you stings, because you invested time, you invested passion. It became, to some extent, it became part of you. So it feels like you're failing, and that's never a pretty feeling. But you're not failing as far as you are exploring something. You have to give yourself the option to fail, which is something that we really don't talk about nearly enough in science, in the space sector. There are so many missions that have failed. Some of them with very important consequences as well. Failure happens. It sucks, but it happens. It's about what can you learn from it? How can you better yourself? How can you support other people in the same circumstances to make sure it doesn't happen again, or it happens less severely in the future? But in your own growth, you know, if I have made so many mistakes, I failed so many times in my life, and that's it. There's a quote by Samuel Beckett that I particularly like, which goes, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. It's about improving on your baseline level of failure, branching out, trying something else, figuring out how it goes. When I talked about my story earlier about how I became a science communicator, I give you a very, very short version of the story, but the longer version, which I'm not going to give you in full, involves me going for another master's degree in space science and technology and thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to work in this space technology sector rather than the research sector. And that didn't work. Or it didn't work in the way that I thought it would, or it didn't work in the way that I hoped it would, or maybe I just found out I didn't like it. Does it mean I failed? Maybe. Well, then so be it. I failed with that and I went another way. It's never a linear path. And right now I'm doing something that I love. I'm doing something that makes me feel fulfilled. And if one day something happens and this changes, what I've done has still given me value. I could do something for myself and for other people that was positive. So once I look at it that way, does it matter if I failed? What does failure mean? I want to do something that brings me value, and what I'm doing now does. So is it really so important if in 30 years time I'm still doing the same thing or not? Maybe it's not. For me, maybe it's not.
No, I think that's a really important message, and yeah, thank you for sharing it. I think that's all my questions. So thank you very much for joining us, Claudia, and thank you for, I don't know, sharing your story.
Thanks again for having me. It was great.
Bye for now.
Bye.